All right, so how's that? Can you hear me? Excellent.
I'm going to mute me so we don't get feedback.
Let me-
Chloe and Karen, can you chat in that you can hear okay? So you may have to ask them that.
Okay. Can you hear us okay? Those of you that's already in here? Just want to check the sound.
Have any chats coming in?
Okay, so I'm not sure. Cancel. Just want to make sure we're sharing the right screen.
See the presentation.
Yeah.
But I don't see the lines.
Yeah, I know I'm messing with it. Let's see if I can. What happened with the Teams meeting? I'm getting ready to. Just want to make sure I was sharing the right screen. No. That one. Share. Okay. All right, are you seeing the slides or my view?
I am seeing the slides with. Oh, now you lost your slides on the page. I can see the slides on my side.
Okay, let's try this again.
Did I lose it here?
Did this work at all?
No.
Okay, minimize. Let's go back again. And this is why we check. All right, window. That one. Share. Is that working? Okay, good. Is my microphone working? Are we still good for that? Can you make sure everybody can hear me? Good, just checking. All right. Technical difficulties, we've got it all figured out. It did. What is that? Oh, fun.
Oh, wait.
I'm not doing anything, I promise. I don't know what it's doing. Let me just make sure I can change without it doing anything super crazy. Okay, good. All right.
Cable was pushed all the way in.
Yes. And from now I shouldn't be touching it other than using the keypad, so should be fine.
There is a bottle of water underneath there.
I have water too, but thank you. You guys know it's for me though, just in case I run out.
And you know, it's Murphy's Law. I went and got you one on the way over here because if I didn't, you wouldn't have had anything.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Okay, so what time is it? It's a little bit after 10. So should we get started and kind of go from there?
We'll go ahead and get started.
Okay. All right.
You want me to do a quick?
If you'd like, sure.
Hi, everybody. This is Jonna Walden, the Assistant Branch Manager here at Tate's Creek. And I just want to welcome you to this Saturday morning with Jessica, who is going to explain the nuances of Chancery courts here in Kentucky. Thank you much.
All right, thank you. As you said, my name is Jessica. My name is Jessica Herrington. I'm a librarian at KDLA in the Archives Research Room. So today we're going to talk about Chancery court records and what that means for doing research here in Kentucky. As we go through this, if you all have any questions, feel free to chime in. We'll kind of get them as we go along. And I'll have time at the end as well for more questions. So let's get started. So today we're kind of going to cover more of a historical overview of what Chancery is and what its foundations were. And then we'll actually talk more in depth about what actually means for Kentucky records, because it's not quite the same thing. And then we'll go into more detail of actually doing the research and finding these kinds of records and what you're going to see in those. And then if you're actually visiting KDLA in person and looking for these types of records, kind of your expectations of what you're going to want to come in with and have some ideas to get started. So we're going to start very basic to begin with some very general terms. So first of all, the terms you're really going to want to know, you're going to want to know a plaintiff, which is the first person to bring a dispute to court. So they're the person appealing to the judge for a decision. Then the defendant is the person who is defending against the dispute or charge. So this is very basic. Just want to make sure we get on all the same page for all of these. And then another thing you want to know as you're going into this is the jurisdiction, which jurisdiction is a description of a court's power, but that actually can mean a couple of different things. So first of all, it can be based on location. So for example, a court with a jurisdiction that's Fayette County only. So they only do cases that are heard in Fayette County. It could also be the jurisdiction. It might have to do with the type of case it hears. So are they hearing criminal cases? Are they hearing civil cases? It also has to do with the amount of money that is involved will determine sometimes the court that hears a case. So a good example is there's a lot of times you'll see more than £5 current money or 1,000 pounds of tobacco is actually used quite a lot when describing court jurisdictions for Kentucky. So there's like a very strange division there a lot for some of the lower courts and the higher courts. And then there's another type of jurisdiction, which is original jurisdiction versus appellate jurisdiction. So original jurisdiction means they hear the whole case. You bring it to trial, the judge makes the decision. Appellate jurisdiction has to do with appealing to a higher court if you didn't like the lower court's decision. And appellate jurisdiction always goes up, and only very specific courts had appellate jurisdiction. So, and usually it was for lower courts specifically. And then some had final jurisdiction and you couldn't appeal any higher no matter what. So these are just kind of some jurisdiction meanings that can kind of come up when you're understanding the court system in Kentucky. And I want to make sure I get those clear before we kind of go into more depth with some of these. Okay, so we're going to start with the very basics of understanding the law system so we can get to what Chancery means in general. So there are two general systems of law that we're going to kind of discuss and mention today. There's common law and there's civil law. Common law is uncodified. It's not officially written down to begin with, and case law builds over time, which is how the law system becomes more complicated and kind of builds with more decisions are made and more fine tuning is done over time. This is a very adversarial kind of law system. So it's two opposing parties going before the judge. If there's a jury, it's ordinary people who decide if it's what the facts of the case are, and then the judge takes that verdict and makes the decision for the sentencing at the end. So that's what common law is. It's very much the people kind of thing building into a larger system. The judge's decisions are usually based on previous decisions, so that's precedent. That's where that comes from. And if there is a long established precedent, that can be as powerful for a judge's decision as an established law is, because that means that they are almost beholden to follow precedent as much as they are if it was officially written down as a law. The other type of kind of legal system we're going to kind of mention today is civil law. This is a codified law system. It is arranged by a central body, like a legislature, who create the whole system. Then they decide, it's very comprehensive. If they continuously update it, they determine what can be heard, what procedures are followed, the punishments that are allowed for each offense. The judges determine the facts of the case and apply the code that relates to the particular offense. So there's not really a jury, and it's not adversarial. You bring it to the judge makes a decision based on all of the rules. So they use the framework that's already established. So they don't have to make a whole lot of off-the-cuff decisions this way. It's very formulaic. And these decisions can stand alone without precedent because they don't need the basis of it to go forward. They have the rules. They know what their decision should be based on the rules that are laid out before them. Now, If you'll notice when we're describing this, the US is actually common law based. We are not necessarily civil law. We have very strong influences of civil law in our court system, but we are very heavily common law based. Precedent is very important. Jury trials, very adversarial. This is us. The only state in the US who actually has a largely civil law system is Louisiana. And that's because they were so heavily influenced by the French. And the French have the French Napoleonic Code, which was a civil law system. So that's where that come from. There's also a strong influence in the southwestern states of the US by the colonial Spain and Mexico. So they have a really large influence in that area on their system, but they're still common law based. Some other examples of other types of legal systems, not really important, but kind of mentioning that there are others out there. For example, there's canon law, which is law based on church rules. So that is actually a type of law system as well. There's others. That's just kind of I want to give you an idea that this isn't everything. This is just the two we're going to really talk about today. Okay, so what does this actually mean for our history? So in general, common law began in medieval England. So these were because king's orders, his writs, were issued because people came to him with a wrong and he needed to fix it. So he would write his orders of how this should be decided and hand them down. And that was how laws were passed and created, because it was based on his ruling. But it meant that he only created specific writs to address specific wrongs. So it built over time based on his decisions. And then judges would have to take all of those decisions and kind of try to apply those to the average person. So the problem is this became a little too rigid and too hard to follow because it was so complex. So in most cases, if the law didn't apply to your situation, you had to appeal directly to the king for real justice to happen. So the king obviously didn't have time for all of the petitions for every person ever that he ruled over. So he would pass off these judgments and petitions to his chancellor. So one of the people on his staff, he was basically almost the second in command kind of to the legal system for the king. And because of all of the cases that he heard, basically the chancellor established the court of equity, equal decisions, or the court of chancery for the chancellor. So there's a couple of different names you're going to see popping up there. So that's where this is coming from. It's the law wasn't fulfilling the need for real justice. So they appealed to the king and the king gave it to his chancellor to make fair decisions for both parties. And these decisions are based on conscience. So what did the chancellor really believe was fair, not what was established in law? So that's very key to the chancery court in general, is it's about fairness on both parties, not necessarily what does the law say. So, okay, so make sure I didn't miss anything there. Okay. So that's medieval England. It kind of builds over time. Come the 17th century in England, Parliament decides to limit the king's power. There's a lot of struggles going in between there. And they actually claimed the right to define what common law was. So it's no longer the king's writ passing down. It's Parliament deciding, okay, these are the official rules, but it's still based on all the common law built over time. So they just kind of reorganized it, made it official, and said, this is the rule. It also declared that all other types of laws are subordinate to the common law that they create. So canon law and all those other ones, they're no longer as important as the common law that's created by Parliament. So they kind of take that kind of control over. But it's still very much the same kind of common law system, very adversarial, very much based on precedent, juries, things like that. Okay, so then English law comes to the Americas with the settlers. So they establish it when they create their colonies. They use the same kind of basis, all the same law books and same rules, the same precedent. That's where it comes from. But there's also a very strong influence from civil law books to the early settlers as well, the early founders especially. There's like official like Roman codes and things like that that they read, and they used those a lot to influence decision making in the Americas. As judges were making decisions, they could be influenced by that, and it started to set its own precedent for that in the US. Kentucky's court system is based in Virginia, so we're just basically heading west with the court system here. But it means that we started from medieval England all the way into Virginia and then into Kentucky, and there's still a very strong common law base with some influences of civil law along the way. So what does this actually mean for here in Kentucky? That's a very different thing. So we've talked about like the common law versus the civil law structures, but that you might want to ignore that entirely for when you're actually doing Kentucky research, because it's going to get really confusing if you do. For Kentucky researchers, criminal, you know what criminal is, but for us, civil, it's not necessarily the civil law system we've discussed. Civil just basically means for Kentucky research, it's not criminal. So if you've got criminal and not criminal, and we just call it civil to be simple. So there's other terms you're going to see here. You're going to see the common law, but they're also called ordinary. So if you're looking for common law stuff, it's also called an ordinary case. Just like before, these are more straightforward. These decisions are based in established precedent. And then there's also the chancery, which is also called equity. So if you're going to see both those terms used interchangeably, these parties are seeking a fair decision before both of them. And usually the situation meant that they had to have more examination because the established law didn't get all the nitty-gritty details. If they had used that, it wouldn't be a fair decision. So they're asking for a chancery decision, not a common law decision. And these judgments, like I said, are very much focused on judgment or justice and equity, essentially. They want to be equal, fair decisions for both people. The civil label specifically actually does begin to take over. It's it's less common in the early years. It's more common in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It starts to take over more than chancery or common law. You're going to see labels. It doesn't mean that chancery goes away. It just means it's not labeled there anymore. As an example, there are, I did a search through the archive stuff. About 10 counties in Kentucky actually use the label chancery on their records. However, 36 others use the word equity. So make sure you're checking for both terms and looking for those things. They're used interchangeably. They mean the same thing, but they may not be chancery records specifically, but they might be called equity records. And then sometimes they're just called civil cases. So it just means that there's a little bit of complication. If you see the word chancery, you know exactly what you're looking for. If you don't, you might have to look a bunch of other places. They don't always label them clearly that way. Okay, any questions on that so far before we kind of go a little more detail with kind of Kentucky courts? Good? Okay. All right, so here's some examples of Kentucky courts with chancery records. This is not a complete list. I will not guarantee that. So some local courts that have chancery records are going to be the circuit court. Those are in every county. There's sometimes a chancery court in the county that was actually called the chancery court. It heard chancery cases. A quarterly court, the court of common pleas, and the court of quarter sessions. On the handouts, you are going to see there's a timeline of some of the more common courts. There's also a summary of all the different types of courts that we've had in the history of Kentucky. So I would very much recommend looking at that and kind of getting an idea based on the different types of courts, what kind of cases they heard, and the information they're going to have in them. Not every county had the same types of courts. So every county did it differently, and I'm not joking. You're going to very much get familiar with the court system in your county, especially over time, because there was a lot of changes that could happen as the legal system grew and changed, especially as the population grew and exploded. Courts got more complicated, and then they got really annoyed and decided it was enough and they couldn't do that anymore. So in 1977, they did a whole judicial amendment and basically started over from scratch. So it's long and complicated and crazy. If you're looking at the timeline, if you flip it over to the back, there's one for Jefferson County specifically is a good example. They got crazy at one time. At one time, there was like 13 courts, different types of courts, not districts, different types of courts active in Jefferson County at one time. So over time, this becomes very, very key, very important that court systems are not stable necessarily. They are continually evolving and new things become changed. Like I said, I would very much check the handouts. For those of you who are online, those will be shared. I can share those at the end. Feel free to check those out. And if you have any questions, please let me know. There is a state court that does have chancery records specifically. That is the general court. It was a court that was active over the whole state up until 1850. And that's when it ended with the third Kentucky Constitution. It was ended there. But it did actually have a chancery court thing. It actually heard cases, specifically land dispute cases especially, from the lower courts were taken to the general court, and the decisions were made there just because they were so complicated and so divisive for land disputes that the general court was the ones in charge of all land dispute cases for the state at some point. So that was up until 1850. So they have a very large collection. For KDLA, we have actually been working on a project. We are scanning the general court cases and getting those with metadata, and they're eventually going to be put online for everyone to access. That process is still in the works. We are not done. That's what we work on. We're working from home. That's some of our long, hard to read. Handwriting is really messy sometimes, but we're working through it, and eventually we will get there. Don't know when exactly, but hopefully into the future, we will have those available digitally for the general court specifically. Okay, so now the reason I said there's a bunch of different types of courts and not necessarily a chancery court is because chancery was considered a way of making a decision. It wasn't necessarily that there was a court that was chancery only. So it was the same court, but they made chancery decisions rather than common law decisions. And you're going to see this a lot when you're looking at chancery court records, because some of the first things you're going to see in the petition to the judge is to the honorable judges of in chancery sitting, because that meant that they are trying to make a chancery and equal decision for this case. That's what they're appealing for. They don't want a decision based on the common law. They want a fair decision based in chancery, based in equity. So when you're looking for chancery cases, like I said, that's why they're not always divided out, is because sometimes it was the same judge for both different types. And so they didn't always keep them as separate records. They just interfiled them with everything else that was a civil or a common law case. So we'll kind of cover that a little bit as we're going into the actual research phase. Okay, but I want to give you some examples because those are always fun to see. So let's talk about some things that you can find in chancery courts. So some of the treasures, some things that I've discovered, just kind of browsing through some chancery court records and specifically. So things that could be of interest. And the thing is to remember here is you never know what you're going to find until you start looking. And that's because these things are only available originally. We do not have most of these available. Even on microfilm, they're not available digitally. You have to physically go through boxes of old papers to find these. So I want to be very clear on this. These are literally the only copy of them in many cases. So you have to actually spend time, and it's going to take work, it's going to take research, and you don't know what you're going to find until you go through the box itself. It's just a lot of work sometimes. But sometimes you can find some really good things. So, to the honorable judge of the Fayette Circuit Court in Chancery sitting. So as you can see, this does start with the in Chancery sitting. So you're going to kind of see these things. This isn't always a requirement. It was just kind of a fancy way of saying please judge this fairly. This is what we're asking for you. It's not a requirement. It's just something you're going to see as you're looking at these records. It's just a really good indicator of what you're looking for. But there are others, especially if it says the word equity or has chancery on the outside or something like that. Or it's a very thick case, especially because it has a lot of questions and depositions and stuff. Chancery cases tend to be the thicker ones, the larger ones. They had more complicated topics. Not always a guarantee, but tends to be the trend we've seen. So this particular case is, I think it has to do with property. between two different people. But what was interesting in this case is it actually has a copy of a will from Augusta County, Virginia, included as the evidence of the facts of the case. So even Chancery records, they don't have to be Kentucky specific. You could find like I said, a will from Virginia, a copy of it in a court case in Kentucky because something about the will had to be decided in Kentucky. So sometimes you can find copies of things from further out than Kentucky itself in a court case, and you wouldn't know it was there until you went looking to see what was in the case. So this is a different court case. This one is, let's see. This one is a kind of interesting because I hadn't actually seen this one before, but the phrasing was interesting. But apparently in this case, they had obtained a judgment on the common law side of your honorable court. They had already tried to get a decision that was based in the law, and they didn't like it. So they went back to the same court and asked for a chancery decision instead. Because when the execution of the judgment went out for the previous decision, and it came back from the sheriff that said that the person had no property to settle the case. So they wanted a chancery decision to actually get something because they didn't see it was fair that they weren't going to get anything. So another example of things you can find in a chancery case, this is a plat. It's a very, very interesting one actually because it's from 1798, but the river for the Kentucky River is actually colored blue. So they have actually gone through the effort of making a very fancy, very nice plat for this case, and it's just part of the court case. So it has the dispute between the land. You can see the little rectangles of the different lands in dispute, and they're trying to settle who has fair right to these lands. But it's just very interesting because you can get some really nice maps and things sometimes from these chancery cases just by going through them, because if the land's in dispute, sometimes they have to send a surveyor out and send back what it looks like for the judge to make the decision. So sometimes you get some really interesting maps and things in here, especially because you may not find those in the deed books. So always very interesting. Also, if you're trying to find the land itself where it was physically located at one point, these are really good for that as well. So you see the Kentucky River. It's got 4 Mile Creek. It's got Indian Creek. Boonesboro is on there. So it's got a whole bunch of stuff on the map itself. It's just really interesting to look at sometimes for some of these. And like I said, this one's from a case from 1798. So it's a very early case for Kentucky. It's just a really nice map. Okay, so here's another one, another Chancery Court. As an example of things you're going to see in Chancery Court records, for example, this is a case. But what it mentions that I was interested in is the fact that a man called John Wortham, he married a Lucy Boulware, who was the daughter of William Boulware. And then less than a month after their marriage, William Boulware gave his daughter Lucy a slave named Lukey. And then the case actually continues and the information goes on, and it actually names several of her children. So it names Juno, Aaron, Melinda, Tom, Marin, Innes, Jacob, Jen. A whole list of her children's names are in this court case, but you wouldn't have known to find it there, especially for enslaved records and records of slaves. This is a very good place to find because they were so detailed about the property that they had. They would name their children or the lineage of, whose children came from which slave and why that should be their property. So there's a lot of basis in this, and it means that sometimes they got really complicated and really interesting stuff in there. Here's a slightly more recent one. This is in 1890. This one's actually from the Fayette County Court of Common Pleas. So you'll see this isn't necessarily a circuit court or a chancery court or anything like that. This is actually from a Court of Common Pleas here in Fayette County in 1890. So this is actually a divorce case. You're going to see a lot of divorce cases or chancery cases because it was so complicated, and who had the right to the money and support of the wife who was leaving, or the man that was leaving and she wanted her support. So chancery cases, you're going to see a lot of divorce cases in there, especially land disputes, divorces, things like that. So in this particular case, Hardin v. Hardin, the woman Rose is suing for divorce and money from Albert after he left her. But Albert comes back and says that she was conducting herself in a lewd and lascivious manner, left because of her unchaste conduct. So divorce cases can get a little juicy sometimes because they go back and forth. So there are other depositions in this divorce case. So there are also some for her side as well. So as an example, there was a deposition from a woman named Georgia Crumbles. She gives her age as age 19, and she does housework for a living. So, and she says that Albert abandoned Rose about 3 years ago without any fault of hers and without cause. So you get a lot of back and forth sometimes with these depositions. You get to make your own decision. You know what the decision of the case was, but you can decide for yourself whose side you want to believe. So it's always interesting to read these. In this case, the divorce actually was granted. But it's always interesting because these depositions can give you information about people that aren't the people who are the subject of the case. So in this case, you learn a lot about Georgia. She's 19. She does housework, and she knew Rose and Albert when they were married. So you get a lot of information sometimes in these depositions from the people who are giving their opinion on both sides. So even if you don't find the family member you're looking for as a subject of a case, look for their families and friends, because sometimes they're the ones who are involved in the trouble, and your family is just the ones who get to speak out and give their opinions. So you can sometimes find some interesting information in there with those. Okay, give me a second. Okay, so this is another kind of more recent one. This is actually the same year as the previous one, but you'll notice this one's actually typewritten. They had a stenographer go in and do this one, and they did a lot for this one. It was a case where they were trying to get money from a life insurance company from New York after the death of a man. So they had a stenographer come in and take all of the depositions. And this was a very large case file, probably about 1.5 inches thick. It's a very large case file. Almost the whole thing is depositions, but it had some really interesting things when I flipped through it. So in this particular instance, what I kind of want to show you is these pages, and it's kind of actually describing a trip to town for the couple. So it's the wife of the man who died. So she's describing what it was like for them to come into town. They were using this as kind of an explanation of why didn't you sign the paperwork when you came into town? Like, why isn't this signed on this day? Why don't the dates match up? It's a whole thing. They have lots of reasons for their questions. But the description itself is really interesting because it describes that they came into town on a buggy or a surrey, which is a horse-drawn carriage. And it said that they actually did come into town on Thanksgiving Day, which was a very disagreeable and rainy day. It was very chilly. They started to town about 11 o'clock, and it was just her and her husband, and they arrived in town before 12. So they weren't very long on the road, not really. And that when they got to town, the first thing they did was they visited Mr. Wright's meat store. He was a butcher, because the woman, she had been delivering fowl for several weeks to him leading up to Thanksgiving. So she had business with the butcher before they went in to finish all the rest of their stuff. So, and then continuing on for this description, they usually put up their horse at Taylor's, which was behind Mr. Wainscott's stable on Sycamore Street. But that day they decided to use Mr. Wainscott's livery stable instead because it was more comfortable than Taylor's. And so they stayed about half an hour so that Mr. Thompson could get dry and warm in the office. So he waited there a little while because he wasn't liking the day. It was a little cold and chilly, and he wanted to be a little warmer and drier before he had to go about his business. So, like I said, they had came into town to deliver the fowl and have their property insured for fire. This actually wasn't the same insurance company they were getting the life insurance from. It was a different insurance company. So that's always very interesting. Hang on, it's not letting me. Here it goes. Sorry, my notes are very short. Okay. So they had also had fire insurance that was carried by a company called Miller and Company. But Mr. Cochran, which was the insurance agent for the life insurance company, was not in his office when they went to visit him that day. He had locked his office and left a note that said gone to dinner. So he had gone to lunch when they had shown up and they weren't able to speak to him. But the husband was feeling ill that day. His head was hurting. He had chills. So they decided to go ahead and go home. They weren't going to wait around for Mr. Cochran to come back from lunch. So they went and they spent another 30 minutes in the stable trying to get warm again. And then they left and they went home and they arrived home between 1 and 2. So it's a very short kind of description of a trip. And it wasn't like they did anything especially important, but it gives you this really fun and interesting insight into their lives. And so you can find really crazy things in these depositions. So Chancery cases, especially because they have so many depositions typically, that you're going to find a lot of interesting stuff in them. This isn't exclusive to Chancery, but it's just a really good example of some things you can find. So Chancery stuff, lots of fun little things, but you never know what you're going to find until you go looking for them. So, okay. Any questions so far? Okay. All right.
This is all fascinating.
It is. It's very interesting stuff. People don't realize. Okay, so say you're interested in finding all of these treasures. What does this actually mean for the research itself? Chancery cases are civil cases for Kentucky researchers. So if you're looking in Kentucky research, you're looking for Chancery cases. Just always keep in mind, for our labeling purposes, Chancery cases are a type of civil case. So if somebody asks you what type of case you're looking for, it's not necessarily a Chancery case, which you could probably give them and they would probably understand, but you're looking for a civil type of case. You're going to use the same research strategies as you would for any type of civil case for Kentucky. But it helps because you know that you're looking for the terms Chancery and the term equity on the labels, which can help narrow down your search. But do not assume that that's exclusive. Chancery cases can be labeled just as civil, or they could be labeled as equity, or they can be mixed in with other types of civil cases. Or some counties, all the case files are together. I don't care if they're criminal or civil or Chancery or common law, it's the same boxes. So if you're doing research, treat it like you would any type of civil case in Kentucky, but keep in mind that you may have to go through a lot more steps if you're looking for something very specific. So just kind of keep in mind what you can find, but do not rule anything out. Search everywhere when you're doing this kind of stuff. Okay, so best access points for doing case file research in Kentucky. You're going to have the case file indexes and the order books. These are the best places to start for any kind of cases, not just civil, not just criminal, any kind of cases. This is the best places to start. Civil file indexes. These are not going to be exclusively labeled Chancery or equity. They might say civil case file indexes. They might just say general case file indexes. You do not know. Order books, these are a chronological journal of everything presented to a court. And these are usually labeled by the court that they were from. So Chancery Court Order Book, Circuit Court Order Book, County Court Order Book, but not always. Sometimes it's just court order book. So check everything. But the good thing about an order book is they're bound in books and they are chronological, which means that there might be multiple entries over time as an issue progresses, but they're in order. So you're not worrying about maybe something got lost in between, because you're going to have an entry every time they went to court and stood before the judge. There's going to be something about the case as it goes over time. So they're very good for trying to get a chronological timeline of things. Okay, so here's an example of a case file index. As you can see, it's an alphabetical list by last name of the plaintiff or the defendant. Sometimes the plaintiff and defendant index are separate. Sometimes they're in the same book on different sides of the page. It kind of just depends on the index itself. Sometimes they're more complicated. You never know, because every county did it completely differently, and sometimes even differently over time. So you never know. Basically get familiar with the index you're looking at and then kind of figure out where you're going from there is always my recommendation. Case file indexes are usually available on microfilm, especially at KDLA. But recently, we're very happy with this, like it's last 2 months actually. We have scanned or digital copies. We have scanned versions of the microfilm indexes we already had are now digitally available in our research room. For every county that we have a microfilm index for is already scanned and available on the computers. So you don't have to pull microfilm, you don't have to load the machines. You can just go between the different indexes. There's still microfilm pictures, so you still have to read them, you still have to scroll, but it means you don't have to go pull the actual physical microfilm anymore. They are available digitally. But in some cases, we do actually also have digital databases that we're creating for some indexes if they don't have them. So there's a lot of ongoing processing with the indexing that's continually going, always. But typically for most of these are originally going to be microfilm indexes is where they're going to come from. Now, like I said, the key here is to check everything for the available years, whether it says civil or equity or common law or just general, check all of the indexes, even if it says criminal sometimes. Because if they grabbed the wrong book and wrote the index information down wrong, you got to look in the wrong, it's not labeled correctly. So you never know. Check all the indexes for a time period is always our best bet. Sometimes they're not even there. And that just happens. People are human. They sometimes forget to write things down. So indexes are great. Order books are the other one. So like I said, order books entries are a great place to go as well. Because like I said, these are chronological of every time it came to court, every movement of the case as it went forward. This is what you're going to see. Each book for order books typically are indexed individually. Case file indexes cover larger swaths of time. Order books are indexed for the book itself. There doesn't tend to be a general index for all the order books. You have to pull an order book, look at the index for the order book, decide if there's anything in that book, and then move on to the next book. So you can't check the large swaths of time like you can for case files. It's a little more fine-tuned than that. But it means you can, like I said, follow the case as it progresses over the time. And it means you can go book to book because they're usually numbered in order, as long as there's nothing missing. Most of the order books are actually microfilmed at KDLA. We have, for most counties, most order books are on microfilm. And so that's easy to access for most cases. You don't have to pull out the big, heavy books. These things are massive, like huge. They're probably 2.5 foot tall sometimes, and sometimes like 3 or 4 inches thick. They're very large books. So microfilm is much easier to access. And order books are also a very good alternative if the case files are missing or do not exist for some reason. If there was a disaster or a fire or a flood or they lost it on the way to the courthouse. I don't know. Who knows why it's missing? But if you're having issues and you can't find the case file, order books are a very good, solid alternative because, like I said, it follows the case. You may not have all the fun depositions and things, but it can give you information about the case as it progressed and the decisions that were made with it. And then the actual case file documents themselves. These are what your goal is to find, essentially. But because of the nature of the case file documents, there's a lot of them. The entire 3rd floor of our building is boxes of papers. And I am not joking, it's full. And we have a second facility, the State Record Center, who has the more recent stuff. We stop at like the 1980s. We don't have anything more recent than that for most counties. And that's just because we ran out of room. We don't have the space. Case file documents are permanent. They're not going anywhere. They'll always be there, but these are going to be very minimally organized. They're very inconsistent. They came to us in these boxes, and they came to us from the clerk who just boxed them up and sent them to us. How well organized they are depends on the clerk who sent them because they tell us what's in the box. And sometimes that's not a whole lot of detail. So these boxes can be organized by the court that they came from, by the type of case that they heard. They can be organized by the date they were started, by the date they were ended, by the date they put them in the box and stored them. Who knows? And they can also be organized by case number. If they assigned a case number at a particular point in time, that's the order they're going in that box. But you have to figure out what the case number is to even locate the paper. So these are typically only going to be in original form. You're not going to find them on microfilm. You're not going to find them digitally. You're not going to find them online anywhere. These are only going to be originally in the boxes at KDLA, or for some counties, they're still at the circuit clerk. They still have some of their old case files. The other thing to remember about these, they're always going to be very fragile and dirty. These are not clean things. If you go out and mess with these case files, you will need to wash your hands after. They're disgusting. Because they were just poorly stored over time, dirty and dusty and coal soot and water damage and all the things that can happen to paper can happen to these. So we're very careful and conscientious of our storage, but they had a life long before us. So you're going through these, they're not exactly the best condition sometimes. So just always be aware of that don't wear your nice fancy Sunday best when you're looking at these. You're going to get a little gross. Even in this picture, you can see the edges of the paper are rough and gross and dirty. And this is actually not the worst box I've ever seen. So it gets interesting for sure. Okay, so say you're happy and you're interested and you want to go find all of these things and you're ready to do your research. So let's talk about coming to visit us at KDLA. So when you're looking for records for KDLA, there's actually a couple places you're going to be looking. So not just us. So for us at KDLA, what we are going to have, we're going to have most court records since the founding of the state would be KDLA. Our archive center has most case files up to about the 1980s. It's a little rough. It's not exact cutoff. It depends on the county, where exactly we stop and the type of case. Feel free to always call. We can always tell you if we have the case of that time for you or not. And then for those records, they're on our third floor. It's not open to the public, but you can view all of the records that are in there at the research room on the first floor at any time. You just come in, tell us what you're looking for. We'll pull it and you can look at it for yourself. Make copies. Well, we make copies, but you can come in and have copies made of anything you find. The other thing for KDLA is our State Record Center. Like I said, this is about the 1980s up into the 2000s. This is the more recent stuff. It's offsite. It's not at KDLA, the building itself. It's a couple miles down the road. It is not open to the public, but the records that are at the State Record Center can be requested ahead of time to be viewed in the research room at KDLA. So if you call and let us know what you're looking for, or call the State Record Center directly for what a specific case is, they can pull it and bring it to KDLA, and then you can come in and see it yourself. Just takes a little bit of warning ahead of time so we can get it set up. Now, KDLA is not exclusively the only place to find case files and court records. The circuit clerk offices in the county itself are a very important resource. And depending on the time period, sometimes your only access point. The most recent records for any circuit court are still at the county. Usually the last 10 years or so, still at the county. We don't have them. Circuit clerk has them all. Some counties have actually retained part or even all of their older records too. So not even just the most recent stuff. Sometimes they go all the way back to the founding of the county. There's a handful of counties we don't even have any records from. We don't have any court records, nothing. Unless there's like a microfilm we have randomly about them, we don't have anything from them. They've kept all of their stuff. McCreary County is a good example of one, just because it's so small and it was the last one founded. All of their stuff is still at the county for most cases. There's others though, there's a few. Now, just because the originals aren't at the circuit clerk though, maybe they've been sent on to KDLA, does not mean that the circuit clerk does not have anything. Sometimes they have, like I said, just the originals, but sometimes they even have microfilm copies of some of the records. Maybe not the case files, but the order books or something like that. So always talk to the circuit clerk as well, because sometimes they have more information there than you think they do. And then sometimes they just sent it all to KDLA and didn't worry about it anymore. Kind of just depends on the county. You never know. Now, this is where the time-sensitive issue comes into play. If it's after 1977 for a case file, you have to contact the circuit clerk first. Even if they physically do not have the original document, you have to talk to them first, because in 1977, the court system did a big reorganization, and it officially became required that every county follow the same naming convention and case numbering. And the indexes for those case numbers are maintained by the circuit clerk, and we do not have copies. So even if we physically have the case file in our collection, we can't get it for you because we don't know the case number you need to locate it. And you have to contact the circuit clerk first for that. This is only for cases after 1977, but it's very, very important to remember if you're doing any kind of more recent research for any cases. Okay, so say you're coming in to visit us. This is the research room. This is where I work. We are open to the public for people to walk in or make appointments or whatever you'd like to do. Monday through Thursday, 9 a.m. to 3:30. There's our phone number and our email, so feel free to call ahead, ask questions in his emails, ask us all the questions you can think of, and we'll try and give you as much information as we can about our collections before you show up. We can't guarantee that we're going to do all the research for you, but we can at least tell you if there's case files that exist for a time period in a county. So you'll know you have something to look at when you get there, is our recommendation. Okay, and like I said, this is what you're going to want to bring. If it's before 1977, a county in a year is enough to begin. That's all we really need from you. If it's after 1977, you're going to need that case number. So you have to contact the circuit clerk's office first. So before 1977, the searching can be more complex because you're not working off a single case number anymore. But we have indexes, we have order books, and we have case files for the most counties for the state. And we have inventory lists that we are constantly adding to and updating about the information of stuff about in our collection. So definitely check those out if you're curious about what we have. We're trying to keep those updated and add things to them regularly. It's not constantly being updated like with new stuff every day, but regularly you'll see new things being posted as we do more efforts of different types of research. And then, like I said, for after 1977, especially, you're going to want to call ahead to confirm that we have it at KDLA at the Archive Center and not state records in case we have to get it transferred for you to see. So dates very much matter for this particular instance. You can also, if you can't come in person, you can make a research request. So you can order these online on our website or by mail. The link is on there, so feel free to click on that. Right now, our fees did increase at the beginning of August. We are now, for a research request, it is $20 for an in-state request and $25 for an out-of-state request. And that's for each record you're looking for. And it includes certification if you need it, and up to about 30 pages. If it's more than that, we'll start charging you. We'll let you know and charge you some additional fee for the copies, but it's about a quarter a page. It's ridiculous. But that's just in case you can't come in person. Otherwise, feel free to come in and browse all you'd like. We do not care. Other things you're going to find interesting on our website, the research guides that I was talking about. These are created by KDLA staff for various topics. We've got inventory lists of various kinds. We've got research tips if you're looking for a particular type of record, birth records, death records, census records, marriage records, divorce records, probate records, land records, military records, naturalizations. We've got all kinds of research guides. Check them out. We do a lot of research, a lot of in-depth information about the types of information you're going to be looking for when you're doing these kinds of research. Additional resources you might be interested in if you're doing that kind of research. So we highly recommend those for anybody doing kind of stuff they're looking for more details in. That's always a good one. All right, so this is kind of like my resources that I've used for this presentation, so feel free to check any of those out. And I guess my next thing is, do we have any questions? Okay, do you have any? I know it's a lot. And like I said, all of my contact information is on there. So if anybody has any questions later on, feel free to contact me directly. I'm happy to answer them. And then for those of you digitally, we do have the handout that I can try and share as well. So let me close that. And can I share things on this, or do they need to actually get it from you when you email them later? Okay. I don't know if it'll let me send things or not. Probably not. I don't know if Teams does or not. But yeah, if you would like it, I will give it to you, and you can email it to any of the participants for sure. That's not a problem. Hold it back up.
I just put my email in.
Okay. Yes. And my emails, like I said, is there. So if you want it directly from me or you have more questions, always feel free to ask. So. Oh, yes. This recording will be posted sometime next week. So if you want to watch it again, take more notes, or See if you can wrap your brain around the more complicated sections of it again. It should be available next week as well. So, all right. Okay. Well, it was nice seeing everyone. Thank you very much for all of for the invitation, and I hope you have learned quite a bit. Chancery stuff's very interesting. So, thank you everybody for attending.